Some of you may want to develop an app for both the iPhone and the iPad, or develop an iPad app separately. If you have a good idea for a new iPad app, you probably should create it from scratch, using the Xcode templates to get started, which is certainly the fastest way to get started, just like it is for developing an iPhone app. Some iPad app ideas, such as magazines, work only in the iPad form factor, such as Flipboard and the Daily. Neither would be as unique and interesting to use if it were on an iPhone with such a small display. But if you've already developed an iPhone or iPod Touch app, you may want to reuse some of the code. It's true that iPhone apps already run on the iPad in compatibility mode, in a black box in the center of the display, or scaled up to the full screen, but that's not the way iPad users want to use their apps. The iPad experience is so different from the iPhone experience that you need to consider redesigning it to make sure the app looks and feels like it was designed expressly for the iPad. This is crucial because people have high expectations for the apps they choose to install on their iPads. If your app feels like it was designed for an iPhone or for the web, people are less likely to use it on their iPads. And at the same time, iPad and iPhone users are accustomed to the appearance and behavior of the built-in apps, so they tend to expect similar experiences in the apps they download. So if you've already developed an iPhone app, you can use the same project in Xcode and simply modify some of the code as needed to create the iPad version. In other words, you can port the iPhone app to the iPad, which means that you modify the code to work better on the iPad. The code frameworks in the SDK work with iOS on both devices, so all you really need to do is modify the code for the iPad user experience and display. Xcode makes the porting process easier by automating much of the setup process for your project. Now you have a choice in how to use Xcode to develop your iPad app, either as a separate iPad-specific app or as a single app that works on both the iPad and iPhone, which is also called a universal app. But first, let's talk about device-specific apps, such as the New York Times, which is different on the iPhone than on the iPad. Device-specific apps are designed specifically for the iOS device. It gives you the advantage of reusing code from your existing iPhone app while also taking less development and testing time than developing a universal app. A good example is the New York Times, which created two device-specific apps in order to take more advantage of the specific device characteristics, that of an iPhone or iPod Touch and that of an iPad. The iPhone iPod Touch version offers a mobile app display with icons for different sections, while the iPad version offers a newspaper-like experience for the larger screen with a popover menu for different sections. You also have the choice of using separate Xcode projects to create separate apps for the iPad and iPhone. Essentially, this means starting from scratch for each one. But if you have to rewrite large portions of your code anyway, creating a separate Xcode project for the iPad is usually simpler, and you can work with more than one project in the Xcode workspace, and copy and paste code between projects easily. Creating a separate project gives you the freedom to tailor your code for the iPad. And if your app's data is tightly integrated with the view that draws the data, or if you just need the freedom to add more features to the iPad version, this is the way to go. Whether you create device-specific applications in one project or create separate projects, you still end up with separate iPhone and iPad apps to manage in the App Store. The only way to have only one app to manage in the App Store for both iPhone and iPad is to create a universal app. A universal app is optimized for both the iPad and the iPhone, and the iPod Touch, which is just like the iPhone. Creating a universal app gives you the opportunity to sell one app that supports all device types. This choice makes the download experience simpler for users. You can set one price, and users can use the same copy of the app on both their iPhone and iPad. Now, if you want to develop a universal app, keep in mind that you still need to adapt your design for each device. You can use the same user interface elements for both the iPhone and the iPad, but the layout usually differs dramatically due to the iPad's larger display. For example, in SoundHound, which is a universal app, the iPhone display shows a large tap button and icons for the What's Hot section and other sections. The iPad version shows the What Hot section and other sections on the main screen, along with a tap button in a popover. So you should also adapt your images and artwork to the display size. Users tend to expect higher quality images and artwork in iPad apps as compared to iPhone apps. You should never consider just scaling up the images and graphics from an iPhone app to fill the iPad screen. You should instead use higher resolution graphics and images. Xcode simplifies the process of updating your main interface from an iPhone to a universal app. In another movie, I show you how to launch Xcode and start a project from a template. But for now, imagine that you are writing code or have started with a template in a project for the iPhone, and you want to modify that project to add code for the iPad to create a universal app. You would see the following summary pane in Xcode when you select the target for the project, which is Navigate. In the Devices pop-up menu, you can choose iPhone, iPad, or Universal. After choosing Universal, Xcode pops up a message that lets you choose whether to use the main interface already developed for the iPhone, which is in the file mainwindow.xib, as a starting point for writing the interface code for the iPad. If you click Yes, Xcode creates a new mainwindow-ipad.xib file. To see the files, open the Navigate folder. You can see that there's a mainwindow.xib file. You can also see that there is an iPad folder with mainwindow-ipad.xib. You can select the mainwindow.xib file to see the interface for the iPhone version of the app. You can then select the mainwindow-ipad.xib file and scroll a little to see the corners of it, and you will see that it's the iPad version of the app. Once you've written some code and you want to test it, the Scheme pop-up menu lets you specify the configuration to use. The Scheme pop-up menu is in the upper left corner. As I explain in more detail in another movie, a scheme tells Xcode the purpose of the product to be built. The schemes in the Scheme pop-up menu specify which configuration to use when building a product, which debugger to use when testing a product, and so on. Xcode automatically creates several schemes with configurations for you, and all you need to do is pick one. But you can also edit the schemes and create new schemes. Now, what you would do in this situation is you would pick iPhone 4.3 Simulator, which is already selected, and this sets the active SDK to 4.3 and the active build configuration to use the iPhone simulator. To switch and look at the iPad version of the app, you would choose iPad 4.3 Simulator. And this, of course, would then set the active SDK to 4.3 and the active build configuration to use the iPad simulator. As I show in another movie, you can then run your project on the simulator. The Run button, over here on the far left corner, compiles the code, builds the product, launches the simulator, and transfers the product to the simulator. A universal app preserves the primary functionality of your app, regardless of the device it runs on. Even though the app running on an iPad might offer a more in-depth or interactive presentation than the app running on an iPhone, it's important to avoid making users feel like they're choosing between two entirely different apps.